tonight we're going to run the entire gamut from the landscape and the lawn, trees, and finish up with the garden. But just a few housekeeping items. Again, just make sure you stay muted. If you have questions, throw those in the chat box and we will do like we've been doing, and we'll get those answered tonight. Some of the Ask Us team with the Big Spring Master Gardeners are on here, and they'll be answering as we go, or put them in the chat box and we will take those out and put in a document and get those sent out to you tomorrow. And as always, there'll be a video in a couple of days as well. If this is your first night joining us, we do have a Google Drive that has supplementary information with each class as well as the video. So you'll get an email with those links a little bit later tonight or first thing tomorrow. So again, we're glad you're here. If you have comments and suggestions as we move through tonight's presentation, feel free to put those in the chat box too, because some of the things that I have included in this presentation are things, ideas from folks just like y'all. So again, welcome, and we'll just jump right in here. And don't let the Tennessee vegetable garden scare you, because a lot of this can be supplementary to lots of areas from where y'all are joining us tonight. Okay, so we're going to talk about 5 different areas tonight, just some harvesting tips, some sanitation and fall cleaning, some to-dos for different crops, and then we're going to end out with establishing the fall veggie garden. So as far as some harvesting tips, of course everybody is still harvesting their summer garden. I know I picked a half a bushel of San Marzano tomatoes last night, so I'm going to be busy for the next couple of days canning vegetable soup and salsa. But we'll probably have peppers, cucumber, squash, and all those things right on up for the next month or so. But as we kind of move into September, probably some of the crops that are going to be there on the horizon that we're thinking about are going to be pumpkins and winter squash and melons, things like that. So as we do progress along, even if you don't have a big patch like pictured here, do pay attention for the squash bugs, because they're very active right now, and you can see several generations here feasting on this one pumpkin plant. And they're also going to be feeding on, again, some of those winter squashes and even our summer squash as we're finishing out the season. So just keep a vigilant eye out for those. If you are growing pumpkins, make sure that you pick those. If they're coming off pretty early, you can actually wash those fruits in a bleach solution, like a 9-to-1 bleach solution, until you're ready to display those in September, October. You just want to make sure that you're harvesting when your thumbnail doesn't penetrate that skin. We need it to be hard enough before we pick it. Also, same thing if you're growing any type of gourds, the apple gourds, the dipper gourds, any of those big gourds, you want to leave those on the vine until it's time for those to be harvested, and you'll get a little bit more longevity on those as we move through the fall months. Whoops. I skipped a slide. If you like to harvest flowers, be it flowers that you have grown specifically, or just like me, driving along the road's edge and you see sumac berries, I'll pick those sometimes to make wreaths and things. And now is the time to be harvesting some of those, and you can kind of see what they look like here with the echinacea and the okra, and then even rose hips. As those turn off and get a little bit more dry, make sure you keep those in a dark, well-ventilated, cool location. So that's just some things to think about harvest-wise as we move through the next month or so. Now, as far as sanitation, we all know that spring cleaning and fall cleaning are 2 things, you know, we don't always like to contend with, and especially as hot as this summer has been, and our gardens start being, you know, drying up and withering away, and we might just not, you know, want to be real enthralled about getting out there and cleaning up the garden. But it really is an essential item on the to-do list as we move into the cooler months, because a lot of the preventative measures we take now are going to help us prevent some issues arising in the springtime. Plus, if we take the time now to do some of these type things, the sanitation and the cultural practices, you know, what we're going to look at in the next several slides, then that can help us when springtime does arrive in 2021. We're just ready to get outdoors and start working instead of having to fix this, fix that, clean this off, go buy something new. You know, oftentimes we'll spend a lot of time wasted because we don't plan ahead this time of year for the next year. So as, of course, we're ending the end of the season, we're going to have spent plants. Some may be diseased, some may not. But what we don't want to do is leave anything like in this top picture. We want to make sure that we get all that material out. If it's not diseased, you can throw that on the compost pile. If it is diseased, then we want to burn that material. If we've got any kind of insect damage that has the potential to overwinter, just by looking at that or referring back to some of the other classes that we've been, that we've done in the last couple months, make sure you get rid of that material so we're not going to harbor an environment conducive for their survival through the winter months. And again, this is just common sense, looking at diseased versus non-diseased. Hopefully we don't have what is here on the left, some remnants of blight. If you do have tomatoes that have the calcium deficiency, like blossom end rot, those are okay to put on a compost pile. You know, that's going to be stemming more from moisture fluctuations and physiological factors and nutritional deficiencies in the soil. But again, if it's anything disease like the blight, any kind of fungal spore, burn that material. And just some pictures here to show you, you know, if we do have some of that disease material, anything like this, again, we don't want to be leaving through the winter months, because then that's just more work on us in the springtime. Plus, you see this environment, just how, again, conducive it is going to be for so much more than just our birds that we're feeding through the wintertime. And the same goes, as you're going to see in the next several slides, about cleaning up anything that you've used in your raised beds or in your conventional bed, you know, the trellises or any of that. We want to make sure we clean all of that up. So to speak to more to that, a lot of us are going to save pots, or a lot of us may be planting in pots. But one thing we want to make sure we do, even if we're saving those little plastic containers there on the left, this is a good time to get all those out if you didn't already disinfect them. When you mix up a solution, again, of 9-to-1 bleach, dip those, let them air dry before you store, and you're going to get rid of a lot of microorganisms that way. You'll notice there in the middle is a terracotta pot. The thing about terracotta is that if we rinse those and clean those now, we want to make sure that they're dry before we store them, because terracotta pots or any clay pot are going to be porous, so they have the potential, if they have any water in there at all, that they can crack through the cool winter months if we have them stored in a location that they can indeed crack. So again, we don't want to leave any kind of plant material in pots through the winter months like this. We want to make sure that we're, again, I'm harping on this, but not leaving any room for disease and insects to come in and take up residence. Now, as we start doing some cleanup, a good thing to invest in is one of these wire brushes you see pictured here in the top right hand corner. It's going to serve you in multiple capacities, because as we move into the winter months, if you go ahead now and rinse off and clean your garden implements, you're going to get rid of some of that potentially corrosive, you know, chemicals that might be on there, or dirt that's caked on there. We don't want to leave those materials on there. If you can't get that material off, the dirt or whatever, with just a regular water hose, that's where a wire brush comes in handy. You want to make sure you get in and clean around where the wood meets the metal as to where it meets too. You just want to make sure that you're also, again, moving all the plant debris, rinsing these off, any of the soil that you're going to have on the end of this metal fence stake. Make sure that you're cleaning all that debris off of there. And again, just to show you some pictures there, if you've had some major disease issues, again, mixing up that 9-to-1 Clorox solution can assist with killing some of those organisms. Another good practice is, once you have rinsed all of your tools and set them out in the sun to dry, this is another good investment. It's linseed oil. It'll last you forever. But again, just take a a rag and soak your wood handles, and that helps preserve them, keeps them from splintering, and keeps that wood supple for years to come. Another couple things to just remember as we move into the cooler months: anything that has blades, make sure you sharpen those. You see the loppers, pruners, any of those things, garden shears. Sharpen the edges of your hoes and your spades with like a bastard mill file that you see here. A whetstone would work really well for your pruners, loppers, and your shears. And at the same time, clean all your power tools. You know, you don't want to leave gasoline. This is where I learned the hard way more than once, leaving gasoline in my rototiller, and then had to rebuild a carburetor on a 2-year-old rototiller, and that's really no fun, and it's a huge expense. So I've learned my lesson. I just empty the gas can or the gas tanks out, drain them completely dry. The leaf blower is about the only thing I leave any kind of fuel in, and but again, if you're going to store gasoline, make sure you're using something like Sta-Bil in there. And again, the wire brush is pictured here just because, again, corrosive substances can corrode any of those metal parts. And then just make sure you're greasing fittings or utilizing WD-40, because that's going to help expel any water from those inner mechanisms on some of these power tools. And WD-40 can also serve a second purpose. This probably looks weird to some of you, but if you take a pot, this is a terracotta pot with sand, and spray it with WD-40, then after you've cleaned those garden tools, you can just set those down in the sand, and that helps keep them lubricated, keeps them from being rusted through the winter months. And you can even see scissors pictured there. Lots of different ways you can do that. I have a huge pot that I do this with mine, and I don't have many of those little tools, but if you do, it's a great way to preserve those through the cooler months. Probably common sense here, but sometimes some of us need a little reminder. Make sure you unhook your hoses from outdoor water sources. Make sure you drain those adequately. I left this picture here because it still has the nozzle on the end, but you want to remove those. Clean all those, let those air dry too, and you can extend the life on a lot of your garden tools by doing this. Rain barrels, some of you may keep those hooked up throughout the winter months, but if you get into some harsh winters, you probably want to go ahead and drain those too, as well as any water fixtures that you have. Make sure you drain those, dry those, and get those put away. Okay, as far as some to-do lists as we start moving into fall, again, we get excited about fall decorations, and many of you, including myself, probably utilize mums in your decor. Many folks will want to go back and plant those mums and in hopes that they'll return next year. Oftentimes, though, that's not the case unless you grow a couple of different varieties, and these are included in your Google Drive. But the Sheffield Pink is one. Also, Clara Curtis, that's one that does well here in East Tennessee. But those are good, reliable cultivars that can be around for years to come. And usually the problem with the mums is that we don't think about planting them until somewhere around October, and those mums don't get fully established in the ground before we get a hard freeze. So heaving, which is the ground freezing and thawing, will often lift those out of the ground, and they just don't have time to get established. So just a little blurb about the mums. But along with mums, planting in ground or in your flower containers, boxes, pansies, your flowering kales and cabbages do really well. Plus, some of those cultivars are also going to be edible. So make beautiful additions to the winter landscape. If any of you have ornamental grasses in your landscape, and this is just one species here, there's several, whether you have the small liripe or the big tall monkey grass, often when they start dying back, they look ugly and unsightly, and we want to go out and trim those up. But grasses is one thing you want to leave before you start pruning those back until next spring. Plus, it can provide a shelter for overwintering birds as well. As far as perennial veggies, we might have several of these static veggies in our gardens or in containers or raised beds. Rhubarb, horseradish, some of our herbs like thyme and oregano, asparagus, all of those perennial crops. I don't know if I said horseradish or not, but all of those crops we just need to give a little extra attention to as we move into the cool months of winter. So just some things to keep in mind. Make sure we're cutting those tops off of our asparagus plants and probably adding a little layer of composted manure, aged manure, to the tops of those. We want to make sure that we cover any strawberries. Of course, this is a huge field, but even if we've just got 1 or 2 fields in our or rows in our beds, make sure we cover those with about 2 to 4 inches of straw. I usually say 2 inches before frost, and then after we get a freeze, I'll sometimes add another 2 inches to just get me through the really hard months of January and February. If you have raspberries, go through and prune those out at the bottom. You can see what the difference here looks like. That's just going to give a little bit more airflow when these do come on. It helps them be more vigorous in the springtime. And just again on strawberries, remember we don't want to do any kind of pruning because they've already set their flower buds for next spring. So make sure again you get those tucked in well so they'll throw off a bountiful harvest next year. Now, about an hour before class, Anita had sent me a question about taking care of hibiscus through the winter, so I just went ahead and put it in here in the slideshow. There are actually 2 different types of hibiscus. We have the hardy and the tropical, and they're pictured on the right in the pot is a tropical hibiscus. And most always, any hibiscus that has that orangey color is going to be a tropical hibiscus, just as an FYI snippet. Here is our hardy hibiscus. They're going to have a more dull foliage, and they're going to have the great big bloom. They're going to be a little bit bigger than those tropical hibiscus. But these will typically do well for us over wintering unless we get into a year, what was that, Easter of 2008. I think we had that really hard freeze. And of course, none of us can help anything like that. But typically, as long as we're adding a layer of mulch to these, and not feeding them, we don't want to be pushing any nitrogen, but if you do give it a little boost of potassium at the end of September, 1st of October, that can help their blooms flourish in the springtime when they do start pushing that new flush and growth. But again, just adding a heavy layer of mulch around the base, that's going to help keep the roots of that plant a little bit warm. Another FYI, if we do get into a situation where we're going to have a major freeze and we're going to be like at 0 or below for 2 or 3 days consecutively, and I don't remember what year that was, but that's been, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. One way that you can keep heat on a hibiscus is to just wrap a string of Christmas lights around it, or you can also add the Christmas lights right at the soil level and cover with burlap or something, and that helps keep the heat right at the root level. Another cool plant that we can store for the winter is geraniums. Now this works for your, what I say, normal geraniums. The ivy leaf won't yield to this quite as well, but you can actually, once they're spent, once they're bloom, you know, late September, 1st of October, you can actually prune those back a little bit and then make sure you get all the soil off of that root zone and store those upside down in a paper bag. And as long as you have a temperature between 45 and 50 degrees, then you can store these geraniums until next spring when you repot those. And there's a little bit more detail about how to do this, like a step-by-step guide in the Google Drive if you have those, but it works really well. You probably want to get those out of the bag every couple of months and just soak them in a bucket of tepid water, the roots, and then let those dry again and store them back in the bag. I don't do that, and I've had success just storing them in the bag from mid-October until about the 1st of April with no problem. But if it makes you nervous to just hang them upside down for, you know, several months, take them out, put them in a bucket of tepid water, just make sure that root system is dry again before you restore. Now is the perfect time to be planting garlic. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because in your Google Drive, if you go to the 3rd folder under fruits and veggies, I put Lucas's presentation in there on how to grow garlic. So if you're interested in that, he goes through step by step in a video with you on that. As far, again, as caring for our perennials, just as a reminder, cut those asparagus to 2-inch stubs after frost and then get that layer of mulch on there. Rhubarb, if you have that, will really benefit with a top dress of composted manure to get it through the winter months. Again, with the strawberries, I've already mentioned that. And the raspberries, blueberries, add an additional layer of pine bark mulch or your rotted sawdust or any compost around the base of that bush. That's just going to give it a little heavier protection. Now, I threw this slide in here because I got to thinking, you know, maybe some people have questions on what the difference is with a frost and a freeze, and what does that mean for plants specifically. And most of you are probably aware when we go under a frost advisory, that's usually 2 to 3 days out. Our meteorologists start giving us advance warning. You know, we have the potential for this. It could happen. So when we get issued that advisory, then that means we need to pay heed, because typically that means we're going to fall into a temperature range of 32 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit. And that can be a light frost or a heavy frost. But then we're going to have those situations where we're going to get into a freeze warning, and that's when we know there's about an 80% chance we're falling below that 32-degree mark. A hard freeze is when we're going to go below 28 degrees. And that frost advisory is actually where the USDA set their hardiness zones. And those frost-free dates are going to range even for those of us here in East Tennessee. I know we've got some folks on here from Sullivan County up in Bristol. That's going to vary even a little bit from us here in Greenville and Johnson City, Knoxville, Maryville. You know, we're all going to be a little bit different, and especially those of you out of state. So what I've done on this slide, there's a couple of website links, and you can go in there in real time and see what your spring and your fall frost-free dates are, and that's going to help you better plan for your perennial gardens, your fall gardening, and all of that. You need to have that date to be able to do some of these chores, to be hitting it right at that happy medium, that good balance line. Okay, so as far as perennials, there's a lot of perennials that can be planted now in the next month. I listed several of those here. You see salvia, lavender, coreopsis, blanket flowers. A lot of these will do okay planted in the fall month. Of course, when I say now, we want to wait till mid-September to mid-October to be doing that, kind of depending on the range of where we're at. We're still a little too hot, too humid right now. We don't want to be stressing the plant by setting when it's too hot, because heat stress can really greatly, significantly cause decline on some of those plants. We also want to be thinking about bulbs. I know that they're out in stores now, or you can be ordering those online. So we're right now getting close to that time. We usually say in October. But if you go ahead and purchase those now, just make sure you keep them in a cool, dry place until you are ready to plant. October is a good rule of thumb. Daffodils, the large flowering hyacinths, those are going to be planted a little bit earlier. So oftentimes here in East Tennessee, we'll plant those even in late September. And then mid to late October is when you can plant your tulips and your snowdrops, grape hyacinths, any of the alliums, and then any of your irises. Okay, also right now, another thing you might want to be thinking about if you have rose bushes is purchasing a rose collar. That just gives you a little bit extra benefit with fluctuating temperatures, especially in January through March. Anytime we have one of those heavy freezes, even if a rose is well established, that heaving, that thawing and freezing and thawing of the soil can actually damage the roots of those roses. So sometimes it can even stunt those back significantly or even kill that plant. So a rose collar like this, if you purchase, it just helps insulate the roots of those plants. Wildflowers. A lot of folks don't realize that fall is a great time to plant wildflower seeds. The good thing about doing it in the fall after the first frost, and I put a slide in here just for that, because we don't want to plant wildflower seeds before frost, because we don't want them germinating, because then frost will indeed kill them back. But if we wait till we get one good frost, plant our wildflower seeds, make sure that we get good seed to soil contact. Typically that gives us a 2 to 3 week jump in the spring. So if you have some major issues with weeds, say for instance, this is a good practice to get into sowing these now. You can mix your wildflower seeds with a bucket of sand or with lime, something that will enable you to be able to see where you've spread those seeds. You know, if you might have a huge area you're wanting to sow wildflowers, or you might have rows. So either way, what this sand or lime is going to enable you to do is to see that, because after you sow those, you want to go, I like this picture with the little girl because she's rolling over those seeds, but she's ensuring she's got good seed to soil contact, and that's what you want to do. You don't have to invest in one of these at all. I will often just put down boards and walk over those. Plywood would do that. You can also just walk over it with your shoes, but the main thing there is to just make sure that we're getting good seed to soil contact. We just got to push it in the ground just a little bit later, or a little bit better. So once we do that, Mother Nature takes over and she does the rest. So again, the big advantage here is not having to compete with the weed seeds. This is just going to give us a 2 to 3 week boost on springtime. Speaking of wildflowers, again, if you're OCD like me, you have the, you just want to run out there and trim everything back, prune it all, make it look pretty. But I've come to realize in the last several years that I need to leave some of that. So I will leave some of those seed pods for birds, and if I'm collecting seeds to save for the next year, obviously I'll do that. But a lot of these spent blooms, I will just leave them out there. They'll turn brown, split open, fall to the ground. Native bees are going to come in and hibernate in the hollow stem of a bee balm plant, which is really cool. Plus just our pollinators. If you attended our beneficial bud or our companion plant class, and we work on drawing those good bugs in, and this can be an environment to keep those around, keep those happy and fed through the winter months. The only plants that we're regularly going to cut back every year are going to be iris. Don't neglect those because they can overwinter the root borer, iris root borer, and so make sure that you do cut your irises back. And also, if you have peonies or pineys or peonies, depending on where you're from, also keep that foliage cut back too, because they're really prone to powdery mildew. So if you keep those pruned back, then that's less pressure on you in the springtime. And again, this is just showing you those encapsulated seeds. Oftentimes we have seeds that are going to just self-seed or popular self-seeders in the garden, and I put a list of these here: annuals, biennials, and perennials. It's pretty cool. Under annuals, I don't have this one. My favorite herb is borage. So if you've attended any of my classes, you've heard me talk about borage. Only one plant. That's all you ever need to buy, because it'll reseed itself so prolifically, and even comes back the next year, even through hard winters. Of course, I do sow a cover crop on my garden, so that may help insulate a little bit, but always comes back. It's just beautiful. So make sure, if you're into the self-seeding, the do-it-yourself landscape, these are going to be proven winners right here for you. Fall is also the time that we think about planting trees or shrubs. We do this in the springtime and in the fall of the year, but actually fall is probably a little bit better, because again, it gives that plant the winter months time to kind of settle in and get acquainted to its new home. So another big advantage here is because the soil is warm from the summer months and that air is cool. Think about it just like going to the ocean or going to the lake, and when we get excited Memorial Day weekend, that water's still cold, it's like, woo! But if we go Labor Day, then the water's had time to warm up and it's not quite as chilly. It's basically the same thing for planting trees and shrubs. So the environment's going to be really important for a healthy root development. So again, if we're planting in the springtime, we're inviting them to endure the stress of summer, and oftentimes we're going to see, you know, the plant's going to tell us that they didn't like that. So fall is the best time to do this. Another cool thing about that is because garden centers and nurseries typically know that folks want to plant in the spring. So this time of year they start marking things down and putting those clearance aisles, and you can get some really good deals now too. And they may not look the best in the world, but with a little TLC, they can actually be some of your more staple plants in your landscape. Some people will consider wrapping trees, and especially if you are in more northern climates, elevations, those of you from Ohio and New York, you may want to consider this. Wrapping trunks of newly planted in any thin bark tree, birch, ash, basswood, any of those trees would be a thin bark tree, a beech tree. But use these plastic winding tubes or a brown paper wrap. And that's just going to help that bark from splitting or cracking. And that, again, is due to that contracting and expanding that comes with that freezing and thawing. Folks also want to get out and prune trees now. But if you have fruit trees, you absolutely don't want to do that now. You want to wait until later in the winter. We typically say mid-January to late February for here to be pruning trees. It's better to, again, trim your fruit trees when they're nearing bloom time. This is one that you can go either way on. I will typically say to hold off on pruning, because if you see these cuts here, and if we go into pruning in September, we don't know when we're going to get that first heavy freeze. So what can happen, and especially if this is on younger shrubs or some of our perennials, if we get a heavy freeze, it can actually freeze that layer back so far into the limb of that plant and can actually severely stun or even kill trees, which is what happened to us. I don't know, what was that, 2011, when we had that really first freeze. It was like the first or the end of September, and it really caught a lot of folks by surprise. So I would just be really cautious of that and hold off on any of that until spring, because we don't want to have a wound that might not heal before the freeze sets in. And the other thing that pruning is going to do is encourage growth. That's one reason that we wait on fruit trees to do it when we do, is because, again, they're nearing that bloom time. So we don't want to be stimulating that tree or shrub to put forth any growth. So just be really careful when it comes to pruning. I just put a list of some colorful fall foliage trees in here. If any of you are interested in checking out some of these, they can provide just beautiful bursts of color. And again, these are going to be available now, and now's a good time to be planting these. Japanese maple are a little bit finicky, so if you are wanting to purchase one of those, springtime planting is okay with those, or you'd want to get those planted within the next month and get those well established before we do move into those cooler months. As far as lawns, right now is the time to be overseeding. Well, in the next month. Again, I'm kind of working in a month, so when I say now, I mean mid-September. But overseeding or sowing a lawn in general, September is going to be the time to do that. Remember, it's not just as simple as tossing seed out there on the ground. You need to, again, get that seed down to the soil level. That's why I put that picture in right here. So especially if you have a thatched area or a really heavy thatch layer, and that's what you can see on this rake is pulling out. That thatch layer can often serve as a detriment for seed to soil contact. So sometimes we'll recommend going in and dethatching, and you can do that with just a rake like you see here, or you can actually go in and purchase an aerator core dethatching machine to do that if you have some compaction problems. And you can see what I'm talking about here. If our grass has been kind of a little stagnant, and again, it's one of those things that's going to tell us if we have issues. But if our grass has got shallow roots and we've got that compacted soil, going in and aerating and dethatching, you can see what those roots are going to do after the fact. This is the one crop that I'm going to say that you You can indeed fertilize right now. I wouldn't recommend fertilizing anything as we move into the winter months. Again, we don't want to encourage growth. But if you have a lawn with fescue, a cool season lawn, then you'd want to apply something like 32-0-10. Notice that middle number is a 0 because we don't want to be pushing a lot of root growth during the winter months. But actually getting that fertilizer on in the fall within the next month, that's actually going to give you a boost again on that lawn, the pusher growth in the spring. Let's see here. So there you can just kind of see before and after. And again, this thatch is that dead brown layer that accumulates right at that soil line, right under the living green grass. So you go through and dethatch, you can see how much brighter and greener that grass is going to be. Now is also, or not now, but when we start looking ahead into October, November, a lot of those weeds that we see sprouting in the springtime, the henbit, the chickweeds, the dandelions, all of those, they're actually going to start germinating around Thanksgiving. And actually that's kind of my rule of thumb. I put the dancing turkey on here so it'll serve as a little memory jogger for you. If you want to get rid of those chickweeds and the henbits and the dead needles and the creeping Charlie, then you want to put a application of 2,4-D on your lawn sometime around Thanksgiving. And that's going to prevent them from germinating and becoming a problem, because when we see those weeds in the springtime, then we're too late to be controlling those. There's also a publication on this that gives you the rates and specific organic and conventional fungicides that you can use for this purpose. So make sure you refer to that. Coming up in the next month is also going to be an opportunity to make sure that our birds are going to be happy through the winter months. I always say don't forget about the birds. They're eating pretty heavily, like at my house right now. They don't get any bird seed at all. I make them eat insects, and they just have to kind of go without until it gets cooler, and then I start feeding them. But also making suet cakes when we get into the winter months, January, February. This can help the fat stick to the ribs a little bit better. Plus, if you have kids, it's always kind of fun to do some homemade suet cakes, hang those out. Of course, if you have other wildlife issues, maybe like deer and stuff, that might not be a good idea, but always kind of fun to make sure that we're taking care of the birds too. If you purchase suet cakes, Tractor Supply has a great supply of those, just as an FYI. So again, we're talking about moving into the cooler months, so now is going to be the perfect time. Hopefully tonight is getting you kind of geared up and ready. You hopefully going to be thinking, okay, I need to be doing this in the next month. I need to make sure I get this done. You can add it to your to-do list. Make sure you get it worked in between buying new tires for winter, getting the heater checked, all those good things. Cutting wood for the wood stove. So add all these things to your to-do list too. Right now is also going to be a perfect time to add mulch to your landscape. Again, this is one of those things we all want to do in the springtime, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But the added benefit here is if we go through and we pull all our weeds, we do the deadheading that we're going to do, we get all of our landscape beds cleaned up, we can add that addition of mulch, and it's going to have a little bit longer time to break down, but it's also going to help insulate some of those tender crops. So I grow a lot of the spring ephemerals, wildflower plants that I've not poached from anywhere, just so you know. I've actually purchased those from reputable sources, but this is one reason that I will mulch this time of year. It gives them a little bit extra cushion for those January and February cold winters. Also raking leaves, that can be a big chore right now. I kind of put this toward the end because we want to add these to the compost pile, or in a few weeks we're going to talk about sowing a cover crop. So you can actually get that cover crop established and then just add your leaves on top of that cover crop, as well as some aged manure, composted manure. You can even kind of turn your garden into a huge compost pile if you will, depending on your situation. Even if you have raised beds, you can incorporate these, or even turn a raised bed into a compost pile for the winter months. Lots of different ways you can get away with that. Some leaf litter, like we see right here, is going to be okay, and it actually serves as a little bit of a, again, of a habitat for our pollinators, but we don't want to have these great big piles like we see here. That's going to just prevent sunlight again from penetrating our lawn, can lead to some major issues. Just one quick note here: if you do have leaf litter that has some kind of disease, if you've had some fungal organisms on your trees, again, that's probably an instance you'd want to burn those leaves and get rid of that. I often get questions asked about the sooty mold. You heard me talk about that a couple of weeks ago. I know that's, well, that's an insect feeding, and they're leaving that honeydew. So when I have leaves fall from my maple with the sooty mold, I don't worry about that. I don't consider that a disease that's going to carry over, and I will add those to my compost pile. So that would be one instance you could get away with that. All right, so I've left the fall veggie garden to last, and of course for some of us, we're going to be right on that cusp of when we need to be planting some of these crops. Some of us, if we're going to plant like broccoli, we need to go do it tomorrow for some areas. We want to make sure we're falling within that frost-free zone, and I'll show you how to do some of that here in just a minute. Just know that fall gardens sometimes are considered a little bit more difficult to grow than our spring gardens. I don't personally feel that way. I kind of prefer the spring or the fall gardens because I don't feel like I have as much disease and insect pressure to contend with. I don't have the dry heat and the droughty conditions to contend with either. The only thing I'm kind of working against, again, is that frost-free date. But for some of us, we might be in a period of drought or extreme heat right now. So that's one reason seeds might be a little bit difficult to germinate. And that very first slide that I started us with the squash bug, cucumber beetles, they are thriving this year. So that can be another issue when we do get our seeds germinated or we plant transplants and they start feasting immediately. So from that vantage point, it can be a little bit more difficult to contend with. Just remember, your fall gardens are going to require a little bit closer attention, and again, a little bit more vigilance needed on your end from planting to harvest, because our window is a little bit more narrow there. I popped this in here, and again, on this slide in your Google Drive, there's a couple of links, again, to the frost-free dates. You'll notice this is for the Greenville Research and Education Center here. So you can see where our date range falls. Typically we say October 11th through the 20th. Here is our window when we know we're going to get that first killing frost. Now, of course, there's going to be some variance there, but on this slide, it's going to, like I say, if you click on the link, you can pull up your town in any state that you're in. So, there was even towns listed in the Tennessee state one that I had never even heard of. I got educated. So I'm just saying there's more than just, Johnson City and Bristol and Knoxville. There's going to be several different cities that it's going to narrow it down to those specific microclimates. So make sure you check that out. When we do think about fall gardens, it does get a little bit more precise as far as trying to plant around the frost, whereas in the springtime, we know if we plant some of those tomatoes, peppers, anything like that a little earlier than, that May 10th date, then we're going to have to go out there and cover them up with sheets and cloth and all that stuff. In the fall, it's a little bit harder to know when that's going to hit us. So just remember, your seed packets, your variety descriptions are going to give you the estimated day from planting to maturity. Notice there you want to add about 10 days to the estimate, just because we do have those cooler, shorter days in the fall. So there's a couple of examples in here that walks you through that step by step. So like summer squash is one that I put in here. I'm not going to go through this entire formula, but we know that we're probably not going to get a really good window for planting squash later in the season. We're going to have a lot of insect pressure, number one, so it's usually not a good crop for us to be considering. However, if we look at any of our greens, we know that we can we can get by growing a lot of these. And often, like this one, turnip greens are going to withstand frost. So you'll notice that on a seed packet, 2 weeks after October 15th is October 30th. And if the packet says 40 days to the first harvest, we add that 10 days because we are moving into those cooler, shorter months. We want to have a little leeway. So that's where we're going to get that 50 days to the first harvest in the fall. So 50 days before the first harvest on October 30th is going to be September 10th. So that's the last day we need to be planting turnip greens in our area. Now again, turnip greens are going to withstand frost, so even if you're planting up until the end of September, you can get by with that, because if you remember on some of your greens, frost is going to affect the starch to sugar conversion ratio, so some of these are actually going to taste a little bit sweeter when they do get a little bit of a frost on them. So I'm just going to run us through a couple of these crops because, again, like I said, I want to get you out of here a little bit earlier tonight so we can really focus the next 2 Mondays on some critical elements for getting us through the winter months. Lettuce, this is one that does really well in cool months. Again, we don't think about this now. We always think about it in the springtime with our onions and our radishes, but it does really do well. You can grow this and eat pretty prolifically on it right up until frost. Now frost is one on the black seeded Simpson lettuce that it will hinder, and it can alter the flavor to make it a little bit more bitter, so remember that. Kale is one, or not kale, collard. Did I skip one? Yeah, there's kale. You can begin planting this 1st of September. You're going to plant this in full to partial shade, and remember, when we're thinking about shade, that's going to be a little bit different now than what it was back in April and May because of the way the sun's moving, so just keep that in mind. If your fall season, if we get into a hot spell, your kale might cry a little bit, it might sulk on you a little bit, but don't worry, when it gets cool again, they'll just pick up and take off just like nothing had ever happened. But heat will kind of provoke them into pouting on you, but they'll pick up and grow again. Collards are going to be treated much the same way as the kale. Remember that your collards, notice this deep green color here, so they're going to be heavy feeders. They're going to be heavy nitrogen feeders, and they're going to be producing leaves. So make sure that you get them into a really rich soil and a good raised bed, rich in organic matter. And this is one you're going to have to be feeding it pretty regularly with nitrogen throughout the fall season. And most of these leafy greens or any of our cold crops or brassicas like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, any of those you're going to need to push a little bit extra nitrogen. I said there a few minutes ago, don't be adding fertilizer to anything, but if we're actively going to grow these greens in our garden, then we do want to push some nitrogen fertility. This one here is mustard greens. It is going to grow very fast, just like the collards. It's going to produce all those great leaves for harvest, so you're going to have to, again, continually feed it. Arugula, this is one that you can grow and be eating within 30 to 40 days in your garden. It's going to do okay in partial shade this time of year as well. If you only pick these outer leaves, the plant's going to keep growing, which means that you can get a pretty substantial harvest from your arugula plant. So just always pick from the outside and leave this main growth alone, and just pick the outer leaves. Spinach is one. I have always tried to grow spinach in the spring, always sowed it in the spring until it taught me a pretty good lesson a few years ago. It just didn't do anything. I thought it was dead. And then miraculously it started appearing in my garden in like January or February. And I was like, what is that? I'm like, that's spinach. I didn't plant that. Oh yeah, I did. I planted that last May. So, you know, it's another one of those kind of like kale. It's going to kind of pout or shrivel up and die, or just not even germinate and flourish in those cooler months. So spinach is one you can plant about 4 to 8 weeks before your first frost. Again, just like the arugula, harvest those outer leaves, and it's going to continue to give you harvest throughout the season. Swiss chard is another one, but you got a little bit more of a narrow window. You got about 10 weeks before frost to get this seeded. You can harvest anytime. Those leaves are going to be large enough to eat. But just remember that those young leaves, the smaller ones, are going to be the most flavorful, typically. Broccoli or any of your cole crops, I didn't add all of those in here. I just put broccoli and kind of lumping all of those together. But you can purchase the transplants. Those are going to be available now. Whereas a lot of our leafy greens are going to do okay in those partial shade or even shady areas. Broccoli is going to do a little bit better for you in regards to disease issues and things if you plant it in the full sun. They're going to need a little bit more water than what those leafy greens that we've talked about are going to need, and you need to make sure you're just continually supplying moisture. So if you have a drip tape, that'll get you by with those. The bunching onions, clumping onions, leeks, chives, all of those are going to do well if you plant those now. Many people find that it's easier to start these indoors and then transplant them outside, but you can direct sow and usually have just as much success with those. They're going to be a really hardy plant for you. You just may need to give them some extra protection. That's why I put that picture in here, just to jog your memory to think, oh, I need to add some straw on there. Straw usually works best. It's a little bit more breathable than some of the other mulches that we could use. And it's going to be able to supply moisture and conserve that heat. And actually onions, even with a mulch of snow, will actually do quite well too. Radishes, you've heard me speak about this one. This is one that you can grow all the time. I do call it the powerhouse or the workhorse of the garden. So if you like eating radishes, they're going to do really well for you in the fall. You can start planting those now and do succession plantings right up even until frost, because they are going to be a cold hardy veggie, and they're even going to be tolerant of some light frost. So you can get radishes right up until even December. And if you planted carrots back in the spring, had those flourishing, folks will sometimes sit or plant more carrots in the middle of summer, and they'll let those grow right up until Thanksgiving and Christmas. Of course, peas, they're going to be an excellent choice. They can be a little bit of a challenge just because of the weather. So if we get, again, one of those unexpected heat waves, and we never know what Mother Nature is going to fling at us, they're kind of like the kale. They're going to let us know that they're not real happy with that. So if we do get into an extended period of heat, those frost protection covers you've heard me talk about in the last couple of classes, it can serve a dual purpose here because it can actually act as a shade cloth. So just kind of keep an eye on those if we do get into a heat wave. But like I say, they're going to let you know that they're unhappy. They're going to prefer more shade. They're going to tolerate that more so than what the cold crops would. So if you're planning out a fall garden, make sure you think about shade just for that heat purpose, and continual water source too. A lot of folks don't realize you can grow bush beans. Now I'm not talking about our half runners or any of our heirloom pole beans, but like a blue lake bean, you can actually grow those, but you got to get those out about 10 to 12 weeks before that first frost date. So this is going to be another, like the broccoli, we need to get out there and be thinking about transplanting it now, but we can have tender young green beans right up until frost. And a lot of people say that the bush beans are going to be tastier this time of year than they are in the summer months. I've never noticed that myself, but I'm a big bean lover, so any bean's good for me. But what in the world just happened? What did I do? Okay, bear with me. Hang on a minute. I'm coming back. I hit a button somewhere. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so we're nearing the end, I promise. I'm going to get you out of here by 7:30. So a list of do nots, and I did not include this in a separate sheet in your Google Drive. I only have the checklist for you, but the do nots: don't apply that high nitrogen fertilizer now, except just that light fertility we're going to put on the lawn. And remember, we're not going to have the middle number, the P number. We want it to say 0 when we do make that application. Don't divide those fall blooming perennials right now. We want to wait until spring on those. Don't trim your lilacs, forsythias, camellias, any of those spring blooming shrubs, because you're removing next year's buds if you do that. So your flower buds. So you're going to lose a lot of that spectacular color if you start messing with those now. Don't prune your fruit trees now. We want to wait until late January into late February to do that and apply our dormant oil. We don't want to till the soil. We want to wait until spring. There are some exceptions, and we're going to talk about that next week. And then don't do a full cleanup of your flower beds in your landscaping, because we want to leave that habitat for our overwintering pollinators and our birds and our butterflies and moths and some of those, even some of our beetle species. And last but not least, we want to do a soil test, and that's what we're going to get into really heavy next week. We're going to talk about why soil is so critical, and it is indeed the foundation for any of our gardens, lawns, and landscapes. And hopefully between last week and our organic gardening session and today just kind of serving as an intro, we're going to kind of bridge that gap for next Monday's class, and then the next week, which is on cover crops. So just get your mind kind of thinking about all of these tasks, because again, I did put a check-off sheet in your Google Drive, so you can print that out and kind of use that as a reference, all the things that we've talked about tonight. And I realize not everything on here is going to affect every single person on the Zoom, but at least it gives you kind of a starting point. And again, what we'll do next week is start talking about our soil. So as we're starting to clean up our gardens, we're going to be thinking about 2021, and if we're wanting to start a new garden plot, if we're wanting to start some new raised beds, if we're wanting to put out an area for a small vineyard or an orchard, any of those things, we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth next week. And then the next week, we're going to go into those cover crops. So as you're cleaning out your garden, if you're not putting that fall garden in place, then we're going to talk about how we need to put something living on that plot to not leave it fallow through the winter months. It's actually going to benefit you for your spring gardening endeavors. So with that, I'm going to end us up. And again, I know tonight's was a little bit shorter, but that was on purpose. So I'm hoping to get you back for the next 2 weeks.